Thank you.
Yeah. And all right, we've got a lot to go through this evening. Um, Hopefully, some of it is familiar, as we gave at least the first couple of sections were the exact same shiur that we gave last year at this time, as a theoretical discussion of what would happen in the event that someone is under quarantine or unable to come to shul due to all this COVID craziness. If you recall, Purim last year was that was right when the first case in New Rochelle had hit, and it's the last time that we were together in shul was the Purim Seudah, and then we canceled shul that following Shabbos, and so it's crazy. We're a year into this, and it's crazy. So what was a theoretical shiur last year has become a very practical shiur this year. So we'll go through some of those sources, knowing that the application is much more real this time. And then we'll just to give a roadmap of where I want to go with it. So then we'll address a unique question that we didn't talk about last year, which is, and we'll be practicing this in our shul readings also. Spoiler alert, everyone's seen the schedule, so we're going to conclude that reading on Zoom is okay. Once reading Megilah on Zoom is okay, is it required that all of the readers of the Megilah have a kosher Megilah in front of them? As we typically, so we're going to spend a little bit of time on that, and then we'll discuss issues or topics connected to a Purim Seudah on Erev Shabbos. So there's a lot of sources. We're going to try to go quickly through and just kind of paint a broader picture. But please, if there are any questions or anything's unclear, don't hesitate to ask. And we'll also be sure to leave time if there's any other questions about any other aspects of the day that people have. So let me just pull up the source sheet and we'll share it, and then we'll get started. I need to share it in the screen. Share screen. Okay. Can everyone see the source sheet?
Yep.
Yes. Okay, good. All right. So just first point in this whole discussion is when it comes to the requirement for reading Megilah, is there any requirement for a minyan? The short answer, again, we're not going to look at all these beginning sources inside. The short answer is no, there's not a requirement for a minyan. There's a very strong preference for a minyan. There is discussion as to whether a group or an individual without a minyan reading Megilah can say the concluding bracha of Harav et Rivenu. Many poskim feel that Harav et Rivenu does require a minyan, but as far as reading Megilah, there's no requirement for a minyan. It's preferred, and given the Mishnah Berurah says, given the choice between reading by yourself or reading with a larger group in shul, one should read with a large group in shul. But that's not because of a minyan. That's because the whole point of reading Megilah is Pirsumei Nisa, to publicize the miracle. The same concept as lighting Hanukkah candles. And so it's all about publicizing something. You ideally want to do that in as large a group as possible. And that's why there's a preference to be in shul with a large crowd. But there is no absolute requirement for a minyan. And so that's step one in the question as to whether Zoom is a viable possibility. Is there are some interesting discussions about it, but overwhelming consensus is that Zoom cannot constitute a minyan. If there is a minyan present in one location, then many are comfortable with others joining in with that minyan. But if there is no minyan, no critical gathering of at least 10 men together in the same space, then that, according to overwhelming majority of poskim, does not constitute a minyan, and therefore those parts of davening that do require a minyan cannot be said over Zoom, on a Zoom gathering, an exclusively Zoom gathering. So the minyan question is not really an issue. Just one interesting source, one interesting thing to note is because, to sort of drive home the point that there is no minyan required, but also to highlight some of the unique aspects of Purim and Megillah reading, is that the Mishnah Berurah in source number 3 raises the possibility that for whatever minyan we're trying to achieve, minyan being not only 10 Jewish men, but minyan being considered a critical mass, he raises the strong possibility that women may be counted towards a minyan when it comes to reading Megillah. So if you have a gathering of 10 adults, men and women, according to this Mishnah Berurah, there'd be no issue with reciting the final bracha of Harav et Rivenu, and it might be considered a minyan. This is one of the strong sources also, that when it comes to Kriyat HaMegillah, there really is very little halachic obstacle to women being able to read Megillah, certainly to read Megillah for other women, but either to read Megillah for men, as is our shul's practice. So that was the first issue, just to note that is an issue anytime we're discussing gatherings on Zoom, virtual gatherings, but when it comes to Kriyat HaMegillah, there really is not an imperative for there to be a minyan, so that's not going to be an obstacle for us. The second issue that gets raised is a suggestion of a parallel to a halachot pertaining to Rosh Hashanah. Again, we're going to go through this rather quickly, but it is an interesting sources to spend some time with, which we don't have the luxury to do right now. But the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah tells us, "Hatokea letoch habor, o letoch hadvut, o letoch pitas, im kol shofar shama yatsa, im kol havara shama lo yatsa." If you blow the shofar into a cistern, into a pit, into some sort of jug, presumably that was a way of amplifying the sound. I don't know why else you would blow shofar into a jug. But if you blow it into any other artificial space, so then the essential question is, do you hear the sound of the shofar or do you hear the echoing? If you hear the shofar sound, then that is okay. You're yotze, you fulfilled your obligation of hearing shofar. If you hear the echo of the shofar, but not the shofar itself, then you're not yotze. You have not fulfilled the obligation. Again, without getting into all the details, the Aruch HaShulchan explains to us that when it says kol havara, the sound of the echo, if you hear the sound of the echo, it's not acceptable. You're not yotze. The Aruch HaShulchan tells us what that means in source number 6. Kol havara hu sheshama kol shofar avalo bebeirur. The sound of the echo means that it could mean that you hear the shofar sound, but not so clearly, or you hear the shofar mixed together with the sound of the echo or something else. So many poskim, when they're thinking through about reading Megillah, doing any other mitzvah over telephone, over Zoom, over radio, over television broadcast, some shuls are actually having a drive up Megillah, I've never been to a drive-up movie, but where they broadcast the sound through an FM radio signal. Beth Tefillah is doing that. Other shuls I've seen are doing that also, right? So any of those transmission, even over a microphone, many point to this source about the halachot of shofar, that you cannot hear the sound of an echo to be yotze. They say, well, that would seem to be a big obstacle to using this sort of technology for any other mitzvah as well. Okay, that's one issue. As we'll see, many say, well, this might be a unique halacha to shofar. This might not be indicative of requirement for any other mitzvah, but this might be specific to shofar, where you have to hear the sound of the shofar. But an echo or transmission, when it comes to other mitzvot, might not fall under this concern. But this is one issue, this is one topic that gets batted around in this discussion, is kol havara, the sound of an echo, that at least when it comes to shofar, the Mishnah of the Gemara tells us explicitly that it has to be the actual sound of the shofar that's heard and not any echo or reverberation. And so that might be one issue at play when it comes to reading Megillah over Zoom or any other digital transmission. Any questions on that? Second issue that gets flagged is a fascinating Gemara from the Gemara in Sukkah, which tells us about the gigantic shul that existed in Alexandria. And we're told that the shul was so large there, 600,000 people could fit in there. That has to be an exaggeration. But anyway, you get this sense of how large a structure this was and how big the shul was. And the problem they had at this shul was it was so big that people could not hear the chazan. There was no tzomet microphone. There was no davening into a pit or creating an echo for anyone to hear. You couldn't hear what the chazan was saying. And so what do? If you come to shul, you get there a little late, whatever, you're way up in the nosebleed section, you know what's happening. So they devised a system where they would wave flags for people to know when to answer Amen. And the Gemara says, well, this might be a problem. The issue is raised that this might be considered an Amen Yitoma, which we translate as an orphaned Amen. What is an orphaned Amen? So there's a few different theories as to what an orphaned Amen might mean and what an Amen Yitoma might mean. Rabbeinu Yonah, one of the great commentaries, brings two possibilities. The first, he says, is that maybe people were reliant on the chazan to be motzi them, to fulfill their essential obligation, right? We know that the whole reason we had a chazarat hashat, so chazan's repetition, was because there was not a sitter available for every person that came to shul. People didn't know the words of the tefillah, and so the chazan would say the brachot out loud to allow those people who didn't know the words, who couldn't say it on their own, to answer Amen, and in that way be Yotzei. Based on the principle of Shomea Ke'ona, that when you hear someone say a bracha, recite something, it's as if you said it yourself. So the first possibility that Rabbeinu Yonah raises is that if you're reliant on the chazan to be motzi you, to fulfill your obligation, then we're going to require that you hear every word that's being said. If you're trying to employ the principle of Shomea Ke'ona, that we're creating this legal fiction that by hearing someone recite a blessing, as if you said it yourself, so then it would make good sense that you have to actually hear every word that's being said, just like you would articulate every word in order to be able to say the mitzvah, the bracha. The second possibility he raises is if you, it's not that you're reliant on the chazan to be motzi you, because you've said the silent Amidah already, so you're not fulfilling any essential requirements by answering Amen, but it's the proper thing to do to answer Amen to bracha. So then he says it's a question of, we're concerned that you might not know what you're saying Amen to, right? Amen means that I agree with what's being said. Somehow that I buy into this idea, I agree with it. So he says the reason the flag worked is because even if you couldn't hear the chazan, people knew or had a general sense of the order of the brachot and the order of what was said in shul. So even if you couldn't hear every word, so long as you are confident that you know what's being said, that would suffice to not be considered Amen Yitoma, to not be considered an orphaned Amen, and therefore you could answer Amen simply by reacting to the waving of the flag or to hearing majority of the words and not hearing every single word. So this becomes another source that gets batted around in discussion of telephones, radios, and Zoom. The Shulchan Aruch rules when it comes to what we define as Amen Yitoma, this problematic answering of Amen to a bracha. The Shulchan Aruch says, Lo ya'aneh Amen Yitoma, haynu shehu chayav b'bracha achat, v'ashatz mevarech ota. So the first possibility, right? He says that it is limited to the situation where you are being reliant on the chazan to fulfill the obligation for you. So on the one hand, that would eliminate the concern that the Gemara presents with the synagogue where the chazan is in the middle of the Chazar Hashatz. But it would potentially be an issue for us when it comes to Megillah reading, right? Certainly the bracha at the beginning to answer Amen, that is fulfilling the obligation of everyone who's listening. The chazan who says the first bracha is doing so to be motzi everyone else. So it becomes a question of, if we combine these two issues, if we say that from the Gemara that talks about shofar, that hearing an echo or a reverberation or a transmission of the sound that's not the actual sound is problematic, then we might also say that we confront the issue of Amen Yitzomah, of not being able to answer Amen and presumably not fulfilling our bracha, because even though we know what words are being said, even though we physically hear, this might not be considered hearing in a halachic sense if it's not the actual voice, but it's a transmitted voice. Again, those are the two, so these become the two major issues, right? This, when we're looking for precedent in discussing whether there is any issue with fulfilling these mitzvot over telephone, radio, Zoom, etc. These are the two major issues that get discussed. Okay, so issue number one is kol havara, the question of hearing an echo or a transmission as opposed to the actual or authentic voice. Question number two is this issue of Amen Yitomav and orphaned Amen. I'll pause and see if there are any thoughts or anything that's not clear at this point. No? Okay. Moving right along. Contemporary poskim. So the poskim who discuss these issues, the first is the Minchas Elazar, one of the great Hasidic rabbis. Inyan Megilah, Nish'alti im yotzei hashomea mehakorei b'telefon. So right, he lived in early 20th century. So he was asked if you can fulfill the obligation of Megillah over telephone. Mikol hatzdadim shechatar hashoel lo matzati le'esor. Right? They posed all different possibilities to me about what could be the issue, why it might not be acceptable. I couldn't find any reason, I was not convinced of any reason why it should be forbidden, why it should be problematic. Be'emet Megilah lo pasalim nitzava kol hakore beharbe havara b'shmiya berichuk. Right, when it comes to Megillah, there is no concern, there's no issue of echoes, there's no issues of Amen Yitoma, right? We don't need to be concerned. So he says there's absolutely no issue with it. And many would say, experientially, Zoom, where you're able to see the reader, might be better than a telephone or radio, right? That it feels more in person. It feels more live, perhaps, than not being able to have a face associated with the voice. So for the Minchas Elazar, there'd be no issue. Minchat Aaron also. So he focuses on the question of shofar and kol havara. Right, whether something transmitted over telephone would be considered an unclear sound, an unclear voice. A sound, a voice transmitted over telephone or radio does not fall under the parameters, under the definition of kol havara, the sound of an echo that the Gemara refers to. Afilu neima sheb'dvarav kenhu, the kol hanim de telephone or radio heavy kol havara anal. Mikom hakom mashma de pasul ze de psul ze eno ki im legabe tzkiyat shofar v'lo l'shar davar. And even if you will accept that telephone transmission or radio transmission is problematic, it's still only an issue when it comes to shofar, right? We can't draw the analogy. We can't extend what the Gemara tells us about shofar to any other mitzvah. So even if you were going to say that reading Megillah, sounding shofar, reciting a bracha over telephone or radio is considered kol havara, is considered the echo that the Gemara is concerned about, it says, well, that Gemara is only talking about hearing the shofar. The Gemara is not talking about any other mitzvot, so therefore no issue according to sort of Aaron Kotler also. Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, he comes down as the most machmir, it's the most stringent in this regard. He says, "Achari kol haTorah hamor la'el, nireh she'hashomea kol shofar o mikra Megilah yedei telephone o ramkol." If you hear Megillah read over the phone, or even, right, he talks about a microphone, even if you're in the same room, but it's translated over microphone, lo yatsa kwal yedei chovato. You have not fulfilled your obligation at all. Sorry, I forgot to move this down. Mishum, and the reason why he thinks you're not Yotzei is Dafka kisheroshim shmiyat ha'ozen na'aseh be'ofen yashar al yedei kol hashofar sheme'azazeh ta'avir v'yoser bo gilui kol o chashiv as chashiv kishomea kol shofar. The only time that it's considered that you've heard the shofar is if the sound waves that penetrate your ear are the sound waves that come from the shofar. And he's sophisticated enough to know how sound works, that you're not actually hearing the voice of the shofar, that it is the waves, but it has to be the sound waves of the shofar that penetrate your eardrum in order to be yotzei. We'll stop there, but that's that's his basic, and he says that this applies to all mitzvot. Interestingly, if you hold like Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, it would mean that he finds listening through anyone who wears hearing aids has a big problem in being yotzei with any mitzvah done by anyone else. Hearing a chazan, hearing a Baal Koreh read the Torah, almost no one paskins this way. And even in the Haredi world, they don't, Reb Shlomo Zalman's a very significant figure in the Haredi world, but no one says that someone who wears a hearing aid is not able to be yotzei the mitzvah in shul. Some will say, well, that's because the person must have partial hearing, you're not hearing only via the hearing aid. However they justify it, no one really holds this way. And quite interestingly, Shlomo Zalman himself quotes his teacher, the Chazon Ish, right? So now we're talking very significant. And he says that after he wrote this article, I had the opportunity to speak with the Chazon Ish. He told me that in his opinion, it's not so simple. It makes sense since the sound is created by the speaker and it is heard immediately in the way in which the speaker said it. It's possible it's considered like actual hearing from the speaker or the shofar blower, and that the meaning of the Gemara is if you hear an echo, you don't have to fulfill the obligation, is because the echo is heard after the human voice. Meaning, if experientially it's a live interaction, it's a possibility of give and take, we all understand that when we speak on the phone with someone, when we're on Zoom, and this is certainly apparent on Zoom if we ever try to sing together, that there is a slight delay and that there is a digital transmission taking place that converts my voice emanating from my mouth into whatever digital waves and bits and bytes and whatever it's converted to go into the internet and come onto your screen. But experientially, it's felt as if you're talking directly with me or you're listening directly to what I'm saying. And so the Chazon Ish says that as long as experientially it feels like a live experience, that would suffice, and then it would not be disqualified according to the Gemara. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach sticks by his guns. He says, I'm not convinced. I don't understand where he came up with such a chiddush. But as I said, he's really an extreme position that's not followed, that very few communities nowadays follow this. But there is that opinion out there. The final interesting and significant opinion to look at is of Moshe Feinstein, who goes through everything, and he says it's really not an issue. We don't need to go through all the details, but in the final paragraph of Moshe Feinstein's tshuva, he says, Mikol makom, kevan shelo barur leheter v'hu inyan chadash, michal yesh limchot, kedei limon'am milirdof acharei chadashot acherot. So this is a very interesting line. It says, even though I just proved that it's not really an issue, since it's not totally clear, and there are some who disagree, and it's a chiddush, it's a new thing, right? This is a new way of thinking about performing mitzvot. We should prevent people from doing this. Why? because if we allow this, then they'll seek new innovations as well. And this is a slippery slope he doesn't want to go down. So he's taught, right? It's interesting to think, what would he say? You know, I don't have the date on when this tshuva was published. But let's say most of his tshuvot are published in the 1970s, 1980s. So 30, 40, 50 years later, would he still say that it's an inyan chadash, that it's a totally new matter to be relying on technology to transmit voices and potentially to fulfill mitzvot in this way? Not so clear. Certainly technology is much more pervasive. So there's that issue. But Rav Moshe Feinstein does say, even though technically there doesn't seem to be much issue, he's not so happy with relying on a new practice, and that it might lead to a slippery slope of other new practices that might not be as permitted or as that he would be as comfortable with. So there is a range of opinions in the contemporary poskim, but there certainly is what to rely on, that one can fulfill the mitzvah of Megilah reading via a digital transmission, in our case over Zoom. As we already said, there's no issue of needing a minyan together physically in one place. If the question of kol havar, of hearing the sound of an echo or not the authentic sound of the reader, seems to be dismissed as either being a concern only when it comes to shofar and not for other mitzvot, or seems to be it's not clear, right? We'll get into a question. We'll touch on this about what if there's a glitch in the Zoom transmission, right? Sometimes we all have that, where the speaker's voice gets digitized, or you cut out for a little bit. But if there's a strong connection and there is no interruption in service, if it's experienced as the speaker's voice, whether it's digitally transformed one way or another, very strong consensus among contemporary poskim that it's not an issue. So as far as fulfilling the mitzvah over Zoom, this is where we come down, right? Certainly in the extenuating circumstances that we're under, where our shul is not meeting indoors, the weather is going to be not so comfortable, it seems. There's still snow and ice and mud in the backyard. Meeting outside together is not a real possibility for our shul. So certainly with those extenuating circumstances, relying on the authorities who say reading over Zoom is allowed, there's really no issue whatsoever with that. This morning, the RCA, which is the main branch with the affiliate with Yeshiva University, the Orthodox Union, came out. Of Herschel Schefter, of Mordechai Willig, said that if a shul is not able to convene in-person Megilah readings for whatever reason, or someone's in quarantine, or someone is not comfortable coming to any public gathering, that relying on Zoom is fine. So relying on Zoom, if you want to make an issue, you can always make an issue, but there's not much of an issue to make, it seems. But the interesting question will be, and we thought this is what we said last year, so I'm a little hesitant to even put it out there, but next year, please God, when things are back to normal, and hopefully by then everyone will be vaccinated, and COVID will be something, if not a major, if not a concern whatsoever, will be a much smaller concern, and we'll be able to be back in person in shul. Will there still be ways? Will it still be legitimate for people then, who are stuck at work or whatever, to rely on Zoom and not come to shul in person? That'll be a very interesting question. But certainly this year, our circumstances pressing enough, and it's enough going on, that I don't think there's any real qualms with relying on fulfilling the mitzvah by Zoom this year. I'll pause again and see if there's any questions or thoughts on any of this. And all this was really Chazar, was really review from the Shir from last year. So the next issue, one of the beautiful things in our shul on Purim, is that we have a plethora of readers. We have many members who enjoy reading, who like to read, and but not all of them own their own Megillat Esther, their own cloth, their own kosher Megillah scroll. So is there a way for these people, now that we've said reading over Zoom is okay, do all the readers have to be reading from a kosher cloth or not? This is, I'll say at the get-go, this is, we're deviating a little bit here by asking the question, even from what I think majority of the Purim world is discussing here. But as we'll see, even here, I think that there is ample room for discussion, and it's important to put out there at the beginning that with the major disruption to communal life that this past year has brought, any opportunity to be inclusive and to bring more people in participating in ways that build connections and strengthen connections, I think we really have to seek out, especially under these extenuating circumstances. So that's why we went down the exploration, and let's just look at some of the issues at play. So the first interesting thing is the Mishnah tells us, I'm in source number 17, let me just remember to follow down over here. Hakoret Megillah lemafreya lo yatsa. If you read the Megillah out of order, you don't fulfill the obligation. You have to read it according to the way that it's written. Kira al peh, if you read it by heart, Kira targum b'cholashon lo yatsa. You read it translated or in any other language, you're not yotze. Aval koino tala lo azot b'la'az, but you can read it to non-Hebrew speakers in their native language. The halois sheshama ashurit yatsa. And in any case, even someone who doesn't speak Hebrew, if they hear it read in Hebrew, that's good. They're yotze. They fulfill their obligation that way. We'll stop there. And just an important note. Actually, let's see the Shulchan Aruch first. The Shulchan Aruch, based on this Mishnah and the subsequent discussion in the Gemara that we're not going to go into all that detail now, the Shulchan Aruch tells us, Tzarich likrota kula. You have to read the entire Megillah, mitoch haktav, from a written scroll. V'im kra'a al peh lo yatsa. If you read it by heart, you're not really reading, but if you recite it by heart, you don't fulfill the obligation. Tzarich shetehe ketuva kula lefanav lechatchila. Ideally, the entire Megillah must be written in front of you. Aval b'diavad in hishmita sofer be'emtza tevot afilu ad chetzia v'karama korei al peh yatsa. But b'di'eved, ipso facto, on a less than ideal way of doing things, if the sofer skipped certain words in the middle of the Megillah, even up to half the Megillah, and you read those missing parts by heart, you are yotze. You fulfill the obligation of reading the Megillah. The Ramah adds, in hishmit tchilata o sofa, afilu miyuta lo yatsa. When he say that if parts of the Megillah are missing, it can't be the opening part or the closing part. That really defines, right, those are literally the bookends that define it as a contained unit. So if you're missing the opening of the Megillah or the closing, then that would be problematic, even if it's only a minority portion. Afilu be'emsa dafka delo hishmit inyan shalem. And in the middle, it can't be skipping over an entire section, an entire piece. What exactly that means is unclear, whether it means one story, what we would call like one kind of sound bite of Megillat Esther, if it means an entire parak, an entire pasuk, unclear. But as long as you hit, there's enough there that it covers the entirety of the Megillah story, even if certain words or certain sections are missing, then the Shulchan Aruch tells us that it is acceptable to read from such a Megillah. Practical points across, for everyone agrees with this. This is not controversial in the slightest. The reason why we are yotze with someone reading for us is because of Shomea Ke'oneh. Right? When we hear them reading it, it's as if we're saying it ourselves. So therefore, if someone misses a couple words, certainly when my kids were younger, I missed many words from the Baal Koreh as I was trying to follow along Megillah reading and keep my kids quiet in shul and hear them banging the grogger and how hungry they were and all that stuff. If you miss words said from the Baal Koreh, you can recite those words in order to catch up and follow along. Megillah has to be read in order. So it has to be that you say the words to catch up with the Baal Koreh. But if you miss something, right, you have to run to the bathroom in the middle, whatever. If you miss part of Megillat Esther, you can recite those words on your own, even without a cloth, and catch up, so long as it's not the majority of the Megillah. Right? All these sources say that you're doing it, if you miss it, you're doing it Baal Peh. And we presumably would be reading from a Chumash, but universally, before Megillah reading, rabbis across the world announce, if for whatever reason you miss a word, you tune out, you're not sure that you heard something, say those words to yourself, and then you can listen along to the Baal Koreh to fulfill your obligation. Right? Many say that when it comes to the listing of Haman's sons, the 10 sons, so Shomea Ke'oneh works for reciting words, but it doesn't work for the experience of saying it all in one breath. So there are many who are machmir to recite the 10 names by themselves in one breath, because if that, that's really a minhag, but for whatever, that's the way that Megillah is supposed to be read, and so many feel that you cannot be, no one can be a shaliach for you to hold your breath. So, so many people on a regular basis, year to year, will recite the 10 names of Haman's children by themselves, and since it's only a small section of Megillah, that's fine. So if you miss any bit of the Megillah, you should recite the words. That's not controversial. Now we're going to get into, I don't want to say controversial, but into some more radical application of this. So the Biur Halacha, and this is, I asked this question to Rabbi Linzer, and he felt very convinced by this Biur Halacha, which says as follows. So the Shulchan Aruch member said, Da'achadil hishmit inyan shalem, that you can read Ba'al Peh, you can read not from the Megillah scroll, as long as you're not missing, it's not missing an entire matter, an entire episode, an entire chunk of the Megillah. The Biur Halacha, which is the Chafetz Chaim, who is also the author of the Mishnah Berurah, the Biur Halacha is more of his in-depth footnotes to the Mishnah Berurah, says, Ayin b'Mishnah Berurah, the entire concern is that the reading has to be done from a sefer, from a kosher scroll. So if it's missing the beginning, it's missing the end, it's missing an entire section in the middle, then we couldn't call it a sefer. We couldn't call it one contained unit of the story of Esther. But if we are able to say that this is essentially a sefer, this is essentially a book, this is essentially a contained scroll, which is missing some words, then we could still use the label of it as a sefer. So Rabbi Linzer's concern about reading smaller portions, smaller sections, Ba'al Peh, not from the scroll, is that it still has to be within the context of reading from a kosher Megillah. So in our scenario, if we have someone who normally reads the 5th chapter of Megillat Esther, and they would like to read it this year, but they don't have a Megillah scroll at their home, can they fulfill that? Can they read that 5th chapter for someone else? On the one hand, we might say, well, it's only a minority of the Megillah, right? And so maybe it would be okay for it to not be read from the scroll. We might say that an entire chapter would be considered inyan shalem, a full matter, one complete matter, which would negate what the Shulchan Aruch and others are suggesting. Rabbi Linzer said that we might be able to get around it by ensuring that all the reading is done within the context of a kosher scroll. How might we achieve this? We're all on Zoom, right? On the Zoom, there are lots of windows with everyone's face. So dedicate one of the windows on the Zoom to projecting an image of a kosher cloth. And so therefore, anyone reading at home who doesn't have a Megillah certainly is within the context of reading from a kosher cloth, and can even read from the transmission of the screenshot of the kosher cloth. It's a live reading. Again, there's some digital conversions going on, but experientially, you're certainly, it feels, you're reading from a kosher cloth. And so I've been to many people's homes where one of the sources of pride that they have hanging on their walls is a tshuva that they or their father sent to Rav Moshe Feinstein, to Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And, right, they got the actual letter back from an esteemed rabbi with the tshuva, with the answer to their question. And this is many people who are blessed to have such a thing. So my first tshuva is in a different form. Rabbi Linzer answered the question on a video on Facebook. And so I wonder if I could project the video. He says, a rabbi in Baltimore asked the question. I have the link here. You can click on the link and see what he said. But then I typed up a summary of what he said. And basically what he says is, as long as the majority is read by someone who has a cloth, right? Majority meaning 6 out of the 10 prakim of the Megillah are read by someone who has a kosher cloth in front of them. It's only less than 50% that's being read by people without a cloth in front of them. If there is a transmission of a screenshot of the cloth, then that would certainly put it in the context of reading from a kosher Megillah. It would be ideal for those readers to try to read the screen. If they can't read the screen, if that proves to be too difficult, and then you can rely on the fact that you're kosher to read a minority of the Megillah Baal Peh, not from a cloth, and therefore he says that would be acceptable. Again, this is more Chiddush. This is not being discussed. I don't believe it's being discussed in the majority of shuls or poskim that are entertaining Megillah reading over Zoom. I thought it was a really, really brilliant application of all these sources and all the issues at play that Rabbi Linzer came up with. And that is what our shul's readings will be doing. Both the men only and the co-ed will have some readers that don't have a cloth in front of them, but we'll be reading from a screenshot of a kosher cloth on the screen. Everyone is invited to read that screenshot if you would like. We're very hopeful that the logistics of all this will work out, but that this is our plan. This is what we're planning on doing. And so that is what we are relying on. This is the most radical thing of this, our whole procedures for this year. So I'll stop again and see if there are any questions, thoughts, points of clarification that need to be made. It's a very easy crowd tonight. Okay. So if there are no questions on that, we'll move on to discussion of the Purim Seudah. And just there's two basic ways. When it comes to Purim Seudah in general, every year there's a question of the timing of it. As we have done, and as I suspect most communities, most individuals do, is the Seudah is typically eaten towards the end of the day, towards evening. Right? There's a very strong preference that one daven mincha before eating the Purim Seudah. And, when we're in a reality of people coming home from work, coming home from school, coming home from whatever else, just the convenience factor means most people have their Seudah at night. We're accustomed to the big meal of the day being dinner. So it works out very well that day. There is discussion about when the optimal time to have the Seudah any year is. There's those who say that it's better to do it in the daytime when it's really Purim. If you do it, sunsets at 5:30 and you start your Seudah at 5:10, is it really a Seudah on Purim, or is it a Seudah on the day after Purim? So there are those who say that every year the Seudah should be eaten earlier in the day. That certainly would be the case in our situation this year, where Purim falls on Erev Shabbos, because we are always concerned that we don't want to ruin our appetite for Shabbos. So if we have a huge, heavy meal at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, who's going to have space in their stomachs to eat a Shabbos meal? And then it's going to be disrespectful to Shabbos, and Shabbos comes directly from the Torah, and Purim is a mitzvah d'Rabbana. So Shabbos, in that sense, should take some precedence, perhaps, over a Purim Seudah. So there's a strong concern that we don't want to ruin our appetite for the Shabbos meal, and that gets into logistical complications because it's a Friday, and many people are going to be at work, at school, whatever else is going on, getting ready for Shabbos. So how you time having a proper Seudah earlier in the day gets to be, is not a simple matter. But that's one. So let's first go through some sources on that, and then we'll see there is a second way potentially to have the Purim Seudah. It's a little bit logistically complicated, but it is another option that's out there. So the first thing I just wanted to address quickly is the Rambam tells us that when it comes to the Purim Seudah, that we have to ochal basar v'yitzakin sa'ada nafa kefia asher tinsa yado v'shoteh yayin, right? That the Rambam and all the halachic sources you look at will say that the meal requires meat. The Purim Seudah requires to be a fleishig meal. You have to eat meat. In general, anytime you have to make a nice meal mandated by halacha, the sources will say it should be a meal of meat. All these sources were written in a time period where meat was truly a luxury item, was truly something not eaten on a regular basis. You didn't come home for pot roast on a Tuesday night. It was something special. It had to be something special to be eating a fleishig meal. And every posek, everyone agrees that if meat isn't going to do it for you, certainly people that don't eat meat for health reasons, for ideological reasons. Interesting question if halacha, has any issues with someone who's a vegetarian or a vegan. But certainly, there's an overwhelming consensus among poskim. It does not have to be a meat meal. It has to be a nice meal. It should be a meal that's special. The Purim Seudah, plenty of people that have spoken with me over the years have had no choice but to eat a Purim Seudah at the office, students in between classes. And it's not, certainly it should be a social meal. It should be a meal with friends or family this year, with friends on the phone or on Zoom if that enhances the simcha for people. But it should be a special meal. So even if eating the meal on your own, even if, I don't want to say even, but if eating a dairy meal, it should be something that's a little special, something that's more than what you would typically eat for, my lunch on a Friday afternoon. If I remember to open a yogurt, then I'm in good shape and I won't be starving when Shabbos comes. But it should be something more than that. It should be something that's special, that's significant, that gives a feel that you're doing something out of the norm because it's Purim. But menu beyond that is really carte blanche. Whatever's gonna do it for you is fine. And certainly, if there's an added concern that you don't want to ruin your appetite for Shabbos, so then having a dairy meal, absolutely no issue whatsoever. Okay, so what to do specifically in our situation of Purim being on Erev Shabbos. So the Ramah, I did not bold the Hebrew here, so I might just read the English because I can't find exactly where it starts. We have the custom to make the Purim meal after Mincha, after the afternoon prayer, and pray the evening prayer at night. After the meal, after the Purim Seudah, we pray the afternoon prayer while most of the day remains, and most of the meal needs to be during the day. It should not be like those who have the custom to start close to evening. We've discussed this. Most of the meal happens during the night of the 15th of Adar. Then he says, when Purim falls out on Friday, you should have the meal in the morning because of the kavod of Shabbos, because of the honor of Shabbos. One who wants to have his meal every Purim in the morning is allowed. Okay, so certainly when Purim falls on Friday, there's very good basis, very strong basis to make the Seudah in the morning, right? You get into questions, right, after Chatzot, after noon, after midday on a Friday, there's, you shouldn't eat a big meal then. Some people won't make hamotzi for a meal after midday point on Friday because they feel that will interfere with their Shabbos meal. But certainly by Plag Hamincha, by the midway point of the afternoon, you should not be starting a big meal if you don't have to. So preference from the Ramah, from many, is to have the Purim meal early in the day this year. And some people, back to the meat issue, many people can't fathom eating meat so early in the morning. So then certainly it's fine to have dairy part of, as long as all that's required for the Suda is that it be done over bread. I have to say hamotzi. For those who have the custom to drink some wine, have a l'chaim. Lots of interesting halachic discussion about whether there's added reasons not to get drunk this year because it might ruin Shabbos to go into Shabbos drunk. But so the easiest thing, certainly the easiest thing, if your life situation allows for it, is to have the Purim Seudah earlier in the day. Okay, so there is an interesting discussion. The Shulchan Aruch in 249, separate source. Again, this is not in the context of Purim per se, but just on regular halachot of Shabbos. We're told, Asur likboa be'erev Shabbat, Suda u'mishteh she'ena ragil b'yamei hachol. On Erev Shabbos, on Friday, you can't have a meal, a Suda, that you're not accustomed to having during the rest of the week. Afilu hu Sudat erusi, even if it's a meal celebrating a wedding meal, it's Sheva Brachos, an engagement, right? Something which is associated with a mitzvah. Yipnei Kavod HaShabbos, the reason is because of Kavod Shabbos. And what does that mean? That you want to make sure you're going into Shabbos hungry for the Shabbos meal. Hasurash is Manabe Erev Shabbos. So the Ramah reads, says, well, what about if there is a mitzvah meal on Erev Shabbos? Baby's born on a Friday. Baby boy is born. You have to make a bris the following Friday. Or it's 30 days after boy is born, and make a pidyon haben. Right? What if there's a mitzvah, or if there's a requirement by halacha to make a meal on Erev Shabbos? Mutar. And so then it's totally allowed, right? You're not going to not have a bris because of it, right? He doesn't say it, but obviously I think he would prefer it be done earlier in the day. Okay. So if there is a mitzvah, if there's a halachic requirement to make the meal, then there's no issue. Right, so many say, well, the Purim Seudah, even though it's a Durabanan, is a halachically required, obligated thing to do, and so therefore we should be allowed to make the Purim Seudah and maybe not be as concerned that it would ruin our appetite for Shabbos meal. The Be'or Halacha quotes opinions that say that if you have such a halachically required meal, and as a result of eating at the bris, at the pidyon haben or whatever, you're not hungry for Shabbos, so don't eat Friday night. Have your 3 meals on Shabbos daytime. So that many say that might be relevant for this year as well. That if the only time you could have a Purim Seudah is later in the day, if you want to be with your family, or that's the first time you're able to sit down to have a meal. So you don't need to be overly concerned about ruining the meal for Shabbos, the appetite for Shabbos meal, because you're halachically required to have this meal. So that is out there as well. You don't have to go crazy with making it too early in the day if it doesn't work out. The final option that's out there is a really interesting suggestion. The Gemara in Psachim discusses people that are having a meal on Friday. Unclear why they're having the meal. Seems this is not a halachically mandated meal, but they're having a meal on Friday. They weren't heeding the advice of the Shulchan Aruch. I know that's chronologically not possible, but you get what I mean. You're having a big meal, and all of a sudden they realize, hey, it's Shabbos, and we haven't benched. What are we supposed to do? So there the Gemara says that you should be poris mapa umekadesh. Take a tablecloth, take a covering, a challah cover, or a napkin, cover up the food that you're eating, say Kiddush, and then resume your meal as you were. What exactly does this mean? So it gives the possibility that you could somehow, in the middle of your meal that started before Shabbos, in the middle of your meal, you can accept upon yourself Shabbos and continue eating, and presumably by continuing to eat, you will be fulfilling your requirement for a Shabbos meal as well. How exactly does this work? I'm just going to go to the summary here, and then we'll talk about how ideal this suggestion might be. So Rabbi Linzer actually, they published it on the Yeshiva website today, but he gave a really nice summary of how one would go about doing this Poris Mapa, if this is what you want to do. So it's very, you need to read through it a couple times to understand what it's saying. It might sound overwhelming, but once you kind of get the hang of what's going on, it's not as complicated as it sounds. So you would begin by having your Purim Seudah late in the afternoon. You should wash as you would for the Purim Seudah. Purim Seudah does not require lechem mishnah, does not require 2 loaves of bread, but does require that you wash and have bread, right? If you typically drink wine at your Purim Seudah, then say Bori Piagafen and drink some wine. Stop eating before sunset. Okay, when it's about to be the time when Shabbos starts, you should stop. You should light Shabbos candles, and you should, cover the bread that's on the table, including 2 loaves of challah that you're going to have for Shabbos. Cover all the bread that's on the table, and accept Shabbos upon yourself. Light Shabbos candles, do whatever else you have to do, right? You should be dressed for Shabbos before beginning this meal. Say Kiddush. By Kiddush, we mean the Vayichulu and the bracha of Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh HaShabbos, but do not say Bori Pirgafen if you've already had wine, because then, right, you just say the bracha holding a cup of wine, because that adds significance and importance to the bracha, but you wouldn't say the bracha over wine again. And then take your 2 loaves of challah for Shabbos. You don't have to wash, you don't have to say hamotzi again, because you've already said hamotzi, and eat that challah as part of now your Shabbos requirements, and continue with your meal. When it comes time to bench, you would say ritzei. You would say the special edition paragraph for Shabbos, and you would not say al hanisim, even though this meal began on Purim. Don't say al hanisim in the proper al hanisim spot, but say al hanisim later in the bracha, in the Birkat Hamazon, when you say Harachaman, after you say Harachaman Yom Chilinu Yom Shekol Shabbos, then you could say Al Hanisim if you want to say Al Hanisim as part of the benching, and then you're done. Once the meal is over, conventionally is when someone should then daven Maariv. Daven Maariv of Shabbos after eating the Shabbos meal. It's typically not what we do at all, unless you're my children, who seem to always begin eating before davening and before we say Kiddush at home. But so that's the basic framework for how this Poris Mapa Umekadish would work. He adds into it that you can't say Kabbalat Shabbat if this is what you're doing, because Kabbalat Shabbat has to be said at the beginning of Shabbos. But as part of the Purim meal, to sing the tunes of Kabbalat Shabbat at the table, as part, to sing L'Chadodi, to sing the Prakim of Tehillim and the beautiful tunes that we're all accustomed to for Kabbalat Shabbat, that would be fine. But once you bench, you're done with your Shabbos meal, it's too late for Kabbalat Shabbat. And that's the basic gist of this idea of Poris Mapa. Right? An interesting question, if one is doing this Poris Mapa, is would you be allowed in any way to attend davening at shul and continue the Seudah? So there, it's not so clear. We do generally posit that if you have to leave a meal in order to do a davar mitzvah, in order to do a mitzvah-related thing, then you can resume the meal when you come back. So as long as there are some people in the house holding down fort, right, continuing the meal in your absence, You could come back and resume the meal with them, but it gets into questions of how big of a hefsek, how big of an interruption are we really comfortable with in that situation. Most people that are exercising this poris mapa option will not leave the meal in the middle for davening. They might arrange for a minyan for Ma'ariv later in the night once the Seudah is completed, but most will not leave to go to shul in the middle. But it is theoretically possible to do so, so long as there are members of the family, members of the people at the meal that are still at the table continuing the meal in your absence. It would be possible to do so. I'm going to put a link to the published tshuva that Rabbi Linzer put out in the chat, so if anyone has specific questions on how the logistics of this will work, you can look there. I just need to figure out how to do the chat while I'm sharing my screen, and I don't know how to do that. So first, I'll see if there are any questions, any final thoughts on this. Then I'll stop the screen share and I'll put the link to his tshuva in the chat. Or any questions on any other aspects of Purim. We're at an hour point, so if anyone wants to drop off, don't feel that you have to stay on the line to be respectful to me or anyone else. But if there are any questions, I'm here as long as needed. Yes, Rena.
I have one fast question.
Yeah.
I normally do laundry on Thursday, to get ready for Shabbos. Can I do laundry on Tanis Esther? Is there any issue or any problem with that?
No issue whatsoever. Tanis Esther is a very unique fast day. I mean, it takes on all the mechanics of a typical fast day, but it's a Yom Simcha. There's no mourning element. We're commemorating what Esther did and the Jewish people uniting together. So there's certainly a covered Shabbos, there's no issue whatsoever.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So I'm just pulling up the link here. Does anyone have any other questions on anything? All right, either I put everyone to sleep because this is the quietest you guys have been this entire year, or things are a lot clearer to you than they were to me in going through all this stuff. But if questions do come up, if anything is unclear, feel free to reach out to me or, just as a reminder, the final deadline, if anyone wants to participate in the Operation Purim to send Mishloach Manot to Israeli soldiers, final deadline is tomorrow for that. We will be davening Mincha, hopefully Thursday afternoon in shul with Torah reading at 5:25. Our Zoom Megillahs, which we now know is totally legitimate way to do it, exercising Rabbi Linzer's Chiddush for some of the prakim, will begin at 6:30. Those links have been emailed out. And the only Megillah reading that our shul is able to provide on Friday daytime is 6:30 a.m. I did send a link with other Megillah readings that might be happening at a more comfortable hour for those not rushing off to work first thing in the morning. But there is a mitzvah to hear Megillah in the morning, in the daytime. So please be sure to find a minyan Megillah reading that will work for you for Friday daytime. Wish everyone a Freilich and Purim. Should be a Chag Purim Sameach, and hopefully next year we can return to these questions being theoretical questions and not ones we have to put into practice under very different circumstances than this year. But it should be a great Purim nonetheless, and I look forward to seeing everyone on Thursday.
Amen.
All right.
Chag Purim Sameach.
Chag Sameach.
Freilich and Purim. Ashir Kov.